Elena was 17, and most days she felt like her dreams were too big for her small world. She worked as a waitress at a luxury hotel restaurant, a place full of shiny marble floors, golden light fixtures, and people who talked like they owned the world. Every shift, she moved silently between tables, placing plates and refilling glasses, while the sound of the grand piano echoed through the room like a secret calling her name. She never told anyone at work how much she loved the piano, or that she had learned to play long before she ever learned to balance a tray. The restaurant was loud with laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations about business deals, expensive vacations, and homes with more rooms than she could ever imagine. Some guests dressed in suits and gowns that probably cost more than her family's rent for the year. She felt invisible most of the time, like background furniture, something people saw but didn't really look at. But she didn't mind being quiet. It gave her time to listen, to absorb the sound of the piano and the stories it told through the music. When she wiped tables, she often slowed down near the piano, just to catch a little more of the melody, even if it meant getting scolded for being distracted. She would look at the pianist's hands, how they moved like water, smooth and controlled, as if they were born knowing where every note lived. She wished she could sit there just once, touch the keys that seemed reserved for people with money, lessons, and confidence. In her mind, she imagined it, her fingers pressing down, the first note rising and spreading through the room like a ripple on water. But instead, she stayed in her corner of the world, apron tied too tight, sleeves rolled up, doing her best to earn enough to help her family and save a little for her dream. Her family lived in a modest apartment above a laundromat, where machines hummed and clattered late into the night, and the smell of detergent hung in the air no matter how many windows were open. Money was always a problem, a quiet tension that lived in every room like another person, one that couldn't be ignored. Her mother worked long hours at a textile factory, and her younger brother was still in school, so Elena felt like she had to help as much as possible. There were no piano lessons from professionals, no expensive books or tutors, just her grandmother, who had played when she was younger and still remembered enough to pass something down. Her grandmother used to sit with her on a little bench in their living room, where an old keyboard sat on a wooden stand, missing 2 keys and stuck on a single volume level. The keyboard crackled when turned on, and sometimes the speakers buzzed if she pressed too many notes at once. But to Elena it was magic. Her grandmother would guide her hands gently, saying things like, "Feel the music before you play it," and "Let the piano speak for you when you can't find the words." Those lessons stayed in her heart more than any school lecture ever had. At school, people knew her as the quiet one, the girl who sat by the window and hummed under her breath, scribbling music notes in the margins of her notebooks. Teachers often thought she wasn't paying attention, but she was, just not to the same things as everyone else. Her attention lived in the notes floating in her mind, the chords she wanted to try, the songs she wished she could write. Sometimes, after a long shift at the hotel, she would come home and practice until her fingers ached, even if it meant staying up too late and being tired the next day. Every time a note came out right, she felt like a little door inside her opened, leading her closer to something she couldn't quite see yet, but knew was waiting. She never bragged about her music or posted videos online, not because she was scared, but because it felt personal, like sharing it too soon would make it disappear. To her, music was like breathing, necessary and natural, something she did just to stay alive inside. At the hotel, she watched the wealthy guests come and go, some kind and polite, others dismissive and impatient, as if her existence barely mattered. There were moments when she felt embarrassed, when someone snapped their fingers or called her girl instead of using her name, and she had to bite her tongue to stay professional. But even then, she focused on the music because it reminded her of who she was, not just what she did for money. Sometimes she wondered what her life would be like if she had been born into a different family, in a different place, maybe one with a real piano and teachers who pushed her to take her talent seriously. But then she reminded herself that her grandmother always said talent is not about where you start, but how far you're willing to go. One evening, while clearing a table near the piano, she paused longer than she should have, her eyes locked on the keys as the pianist finished a song. She felt her hands twitch at her sides, like they wanted to play even though she was stuck holding a tray of glasses. The pianist looked at her for a brief second, giving a tiny smile, as if they noticed her longing. But then they turned back to their sheet music, and the moment passed like a gust of wind. Elena walked away, cheeks warm, wishing she had the courage to ask if she could play just once before the restaurant opened or after it closed. But she could already hear the answer in her mind, someone laughing or telling her it wasn't appropriate, that she was there to serve, not to perform. She didn't want to be a burden or make a fool of herself, so she kept her dream tucked safely inside, like a letter she wasn't ready to open. Even so, the idea didn't fade, not completely. It stayed like a spark she guarded with both hands, waiting for the right moment to blaze. On her breaks, she sometimes sat outside behind the hotel, where the smell of trash and cigarette smoke mixed with the cool night air. She would close her eyes and imagine the piano in front of her, her fingers moving over invisible keys, creating invisible songs only she could hear. She wondered if anyone would ever listen, if her music could ever reach beyond her small routine of home, school, and work. She wondered if maybe, just maybe, the world was bigger than she thought, and her place in it could be bigger too. She didn't want fame or money or applause, not really. She just wanted a chance, a small one, to show what she could do, a chance to sit at a real piano, to let her heart speak in a way her voice never could, a chance to feel like she belonged somewhere, not just as a waitress or a student, but as someone who mattered, someone with something to say. Every night as she walked home, the city lights flickered like a song, car horns and footsteps forming a rhythm beneath the melody in her head. The hotel sign glowed behind her, and in the distance she could still hear the last notes of the piano echoing like a promise. She held on to that sound the whole way home, whispering a silent vow to herself that she wouldn't give up. Not yet, not ever, because even in the noise of the world, she felt like music had a place for her, waiting patiently, just out of reach, but not impossible to grasp. And deep down, she believed that one day, the quiet dreamer might finally find her voice, and when she did, the world would hear her, even if just for a moment. For now, she walked through her loud world with her quiet dreams, letting them grow in the spaces no one else could see, knowing the right moment would come, and when it did, she would be ready. She didn't know when or how or what it would look like, but she believed, truly believed, that life had a surprise waiting for her, something she couldn't imagine yet, but could feel like a heartbeat in her chest, and that belief was enough to keep her going, enough to make her smile to herself as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, enough to make her sit at her old keyboard again, press a key and start to play. Elena's story began long before the hotel, long before the marble floors and chandeliers and the quiet ache in her chest every time she heard the piano. It began in that small apartment above the laundromat, where the world felt loud on the outside but soft on the inside. A place where detergent smelled like comfort and the whirring machines below sounded like background music to her childhood. She remembered being 5 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor, hearing her grandmother play a melody so gentle it made the air feel different, as if even the light coming through the curtains wanted to listen. Her grandmother was the first person who ever told her music could speak, that a note could hold a memory, a hope, a fear, or a dream, that a song could feel like a conversation with the world. She didn't always understand the words, but she understood the feeling. The way the piano keys clicked beneath her grandmother's fingers like footsteps to someplace magical. Back then, the keyboard still worked properly, and Elena thought it looked like a gateway, not an instrument, as if pressing a key could open a door to another life. Her grandmother played slow, soft songs that made Elena think of warm afternoons and stories that lived in the air like dust in sunlight. Sometimes, her grandmother's hands trembled a little, age catching up to her. But the notes stayed strong, and Elena could feel their meaning even if she couldn't name it. Her grandmother would say things like, "Music isn't for impressing, it's for expressing, and every time you play, you leave a piece of yourself behind." And those words stayed with Elena, shaping her long before the world tried to shape her into something smaller. As Elena got older, the world grew heavier, like it had hands pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her of responsibilities, bills, expectations, things more practical than music. Her mother didn't have much time for dreaming, not when the factory demanded so much of her. Long shifts and sore feet and tired eyes that tried to stay gentle even when exhaustion made them sting. Her mother never discouraged her. But she didn't encourage her either. Not because she didn't care, but because she was scared to feed a dream she worried the world would crush. So Elena learned to chase her dream quietly, like holding a flame in her hands, protecting it from wind and doubt. She practiced whenever she could, sometimes before school, sometimes late at night when everyone else slept, fingers moving slowly at first, then faster, trying to match the ideas in her head with the sounds she made. She learned by listening to songs online through cheap headphones, replaying sections over and over, pausing just to understand how the notes connected like puzzle pieces. She copied sheet music by hand into notebooks because printing costs were too high, filling page after page with scribbles that only she understood. Her notebook covers got worn, corners folded, pages smudged with graphite, but they felt like treasure, like proof she was building something real. Even if it wasn't finished yet, her grandmother noticed her dedication, noticed the way Elena seemed to disappear into the music, and she started telling her stories about her own youth, how she used to play at community centers and school events, not professionally, but with passion. She talked about how music helped her stay hopeful even when life wasn't easy, how every song was like taking a breath when the world felt suffocating. Elena held onto those stories, stored them like seeds inside her, waiting for them to bloom. School became a place she walked through, not a place she felt she belonged to, like a hallway she just had to pass to get back to the piano. Classmates sometimes teased her for being quiet, called her shy or strange or boring. But she never let those words in. She let the music take up the space those insults tried to fill. Her teachers talked about college applications, career plans, stability, salaries, and she nodded politely, even when her mind was already humming with a melody she wanted to write down. The guidance counselor asked her once what she wanted to be, and Elena said softly, "A pianist." But the counselor blinked, paused, and said, "You should have a backup plan." Like her dream was a fragile vase already cracked. Elena thanked them, but inside she felt something sharp, like a string pulled too tight, like being seen but not believed. After that, she kept her dream closer to her chest, like a secret she was scared to show the wrong person. At home, the laundromat below was always alive. Machines rattling, people chatting, children running, clothes tumbling, and Elena learned to play through all of it, blocking out the noise like a skill, a discipline, a form of focus that made her stronger. She liked to imagine the laundromat sounds were percussion to her piano, like life and music collaborating. Even if no one else could hear it that way, she learned to play with emotion instead of perfection, because perfection felt unreachable, but emotion was always there, ready to pour out like water when she pressed a key. The keyboard started breaking as the years went on. First one key stuck, then another sounded slightly off-pitch, like the memory of a note instead of the note itself. But she adjusted, rewrote songs around the broken pieces, found music in imperfections. Her grandmother would watch her with proud eyes, saying, "One day you'll outgrow this keyboard." Not like a warning, but like a prophecy. Her mother smiled more with her eyes than with her lips when she heard Elena play, tired but trying, hearing hope in every chord even if she didn't always show it. There were days when Elena doubted herself, days when her fingers fumbled, when the music felt far away, like trying to reach for something underwater, blurry and distorted. On those days, she would sit with her hands on the keys without pressing anything, just feeling the texture of the plastic beneath her fingertips, reminding herself that beginnings always feel like stumbling. She learned patience, learned resilience, learned that progress doesn't always feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like trying again and again, until the trying becomes its own kind of progress. When she was 16, her grandmother got sick, and suddenly the apartment felt different, smaller, quieter, like the walls were holding their breath. Elena spent more time by her side, talking to her, playing for her, letting the music fill the spaces that fear tried to occupy. Her grandmother would close her eyes and listen, smiling gently, whispering things like, "You're ready," and "Don't ever let anyone tell you who you are." Those words rooted themselves deep inside Elena, like anchors and wings at the same time, holding her steady while urging her forward. The day her grandmother passed, the apartment felt hollow, and Elena couldn't bring herself to play for a week, her hands trembling whenever she reached for the keys. Her mother hugged her, something rare, holding her for a long time, and said, "Keep playing, she loved hearing you." And that was the first time Elena played again, tears on her cheeks, the song breaking and rebuilding her with every measure. It wasn't a performance, it wasn't even music in the way most people would define it, but it was honest, and that honesty stitched her back together, piece by piece, note by note. She realized then that music was not just a dream. It was her language, her way of surviving the world, her way of loving the people she couldn't hold on to forever. That moment changed her, made her braver, like something inside her healed into strength instead of pain. She promised herself she would not let her dream fade into the background, not let it turn into a story she would only talk about in past tense someday. So she started looking for chances, small ones, ways to get closer to real pianos, real stages, real audiences, even if it meant working harder, sleeping less, risking embarrassment, risking failure. She applied for part-time jobs, all of them, until the hotel called, offering her a position as a waitress, not as a pianist, but she still said yes, because it felt like stepping into a world where music lived in the walls, where pianos sat like royalty in rooms full of chandeliers. She didn't tell them she could play. She wanted to earn her place first, to prove she wasn't just a hopeful teenager with nothing to back it up. The first time she walked into the hotel, she felt like she was stepping into another planet, where everything sparkled and people moved like they had somewhere important to be. She felt small, but she also felt close to something, like the beginning of a bridge she didn't know how to cross yet. And when she heard the piano in the restaurant for the first time, live and rich and full, she felt her heartbeat change, like it was matching the tempo without her control. She didn't know then that her life was already shifting, that every tray she carried, every table she cleaned, every note she listened to from a distance, was quietly pushing her toward the moment when she would finally sit at that piano herself and let the world hear her. All she knew was that she was stepping into a chapter she didn't know how to name yet, but it felt like purpose, like breathing deeper for the first time. She walked through those fancy halls with her quiet dream burning steady inside her, never loud, but never fading, like a melody waiting for its cue. And every night, after her shift, she went home, climbed the stairs above the laundromat, sat at her cracked keyboard, and played with more determination than ever, because now she was close enough to touch the dream, even if she hadn't reached it yet, and she could feel something in the air, like a door quietly unlocking, waiting for the right moment to open. The night that changed everything didn't look special at first. It looked like any other evening at the hotel, with the lobby glowing under chandelier lights and the restaurant filling with the usual quiet buzz of expensive conversations. Elena arrived early, apron folded over her arm, hair tied back the same way she did every day, trying to look neat even though her nerves always made her feel a little out of place. She clocked in, tied her apron, washed her hands, and walked into the dining room, ready to start another shift serving food, while wishing she were the one playing the piano instead of wiping tables near it. But even before she stepped fully into the room, she felt something different in the air, like a current of tension running under the floor, the kind that made people walk faster and talk sharper. The hotel manager stood in the center of the room with a tablet in hand, pacing back and forth like she was waiting for someone to deliver bad news. Her eyebrows pulled tight together, chefs hurried in and out of the kitchen, servers whispered to each other, and one of the hosts looked like she was close to tears as she cracked her knuckles nervously. This wasn't normal, not even for a busy night, and Elena's stomach tightened as she wondered what had gone wrong. The manager finally looked up and spotted her, motioning for her to come over, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor as if even the building was paying attention. "Elena," the manager said with a strained voice. "The pianist just called. They're sick. They can't make it tonight." For a second, Elena didn't understand what that meant, her mind registering the words slowly as if they were coming through static. Then it hit her: the hotel was hosting a high-profile charity dinner in just 2 hours, an event announced weeks ago, an event where wealthy guests, business owners, and even local celebrities were expected to attend, the kind of crowd that expected everything to be perfect. The piano wasn't just decoration tonight, it was part of the experience, a symbol that the hotel valued class and elegance. And now, suddenly, there was no one to play it. The silence that followed the announcement felt heavy, like the whole room was suspended in one long breath. Someone suggested contacting another musician, but the manager shook her head, saying she had already tried, and no one was available on such short notice. Every pianist she knew was booked, unavailable, or too far away to make it in time. A server with a sharp voice muttered something like, "We're doomed," under his breath, and someone else sighed dramatically, resting her face in her hands. Elena's heart began to race, a spark inside her flickering dangerously close to becoming a flame. She swallowed hard, hands trembling slightly, trying to gather enough courage to let the words form. Because the idea that came into her mind was ridiculous, outrageous, something she had never thought she would say out loud, but she said it anyway. Her voice soft but steady, "I can play." Everyone froze, heads turning slowly toward her like she had just shouted instead of spoken calmly. The manager blinked, confused. "What do you mean you can play?" she asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and impatience. Elena felt her face heat up, but she didn't look away. She stood a little straighter. "I can play the piano. I've been playing since I was little," she said, her voice shaking but her words firm. A few servers exchanged looks. One raised his eyebrows. Another smirked as if she had just made a joke, and someone whispered, "She plays." Like the idea itself was funny. Elena didn't blame them. They had only ever seen her carry trays and take orders, never once touching the piano, never once speaking about her music. The manager stared at her for a long moment, like she was trying to decide if she should take her seriously or laugh. Finally, she sighed and rubbed her forehead. "This is a very important night, Elena," she said carefully. "We can't afford mistakes. We need someone professional, someone trained." Elena felt those words like a slap, not cruel, just heavy, full of doubt that made her heart ache. But she understood where they came from. She understood why the manager hesitated. Still, something inside her refused to back down. A stubbornness that felt like her grandmother's voice in her ear saying, "Don't let fear decide for you." So she took a step closer, her voice gaining strength. "I know I'm not a professional, but I promise I can do it. Please, just let me try. Just give me one chance." The room seemed to tilt. Everyone watching, waiting. The decision lingering in the air like a held note. The manager looked conflicted, torn between desperation and caution, between risk and necessity. There was no time to find someone else, not really, and the hotel's reputation was on the line. Finally, the manager exhaled sharply. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "But if you mess up, even a little, you stop immediately and return to your station. Understood?" Elena nodded, her pulse pounding like a drumbeat in her ears. "Understood," she whispered. The smirks vanished, replaced with curiosity and a little disbelief, as if everyone was watching the beginning of something unpredictable. She walked toward the piano, every step feeling like a question she didn't know how to answer yet. The grand piano sat near the center of the room, polished to a shine, its surface reflecting the chandelier lights like starlight on dark water. She hesitated, her hand hovering above the bench, afraid that the moment she sat down someone would tell her to stop, that this was a mistake, that she wasn't allowed. But no one spoke, no one pulled her away, so she sat, feeling the leather cushion beneath her like a throne she wasn't sure she deserved. Her fingers hovered above the keys, just for a second, that familiar shock of fear and excitement buzzing through her like electricity. This wasn't her old keyboard with missing keys and static in the speakers. It was a real piano, full and warm and heavy with history. A piano meant for people with resumes and reputations. She swallowed, remembering the laundromat noise, the crackling keys at home, the neighbors arguing through thin walls, the years of practicing alone, playing for her grandmother, playing to heal, playing because music was the only place she felt whole. She pressed one key, just one, and the sound was so clear it made her chest tighten, like hearing her own voice for the first time. Then another, and another, feeling for the keys the way a blind person feels for a familiar path. Her fingers learning the shape of this new instrument with quiet devotion. People watched from across the room, but she didn't look at them. She focused on the keys, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the sound. For now, she wasn't performing. She was just remembering who she was. After a minute, the manager came over, arms crossed, watching her hands with a mix of caution and surprise. "Play something?" the manager said, voice low. "I need to hear you before the guests arrive." So Elena played, not a full song, just the opening lines of something she had written herself, something she had never shown anyone. A simple melody that felt like morning sunlight creeping over a windowsill, soft and promising. Her fingers moved nervously at first, but the sound held steady, warm and alive, growing in confidence as she continued. The music lingered in the air, the hotel's polished surfaces carrying the notes like they were meant to live there, like they belonged. When she stopped, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like applause waiting to happen. Even though no one clapped, not yet, the manager exhaled slowly, her expression changing, softer, thoughtful, maybe even a little hopeful. "All right," she said quietly. "You can play tonight." Elena nodded, but inside, everything was spinning. Fear and excitement and disbelief hitting her all at once. She had never played for anyone outside her family before, never played on a real instrument like this, never played in a room full of people who had no idea who she was. Now she was going to play for the elite, for people who came to be impressed, entertained, dazzled, not to watch a 17-year-old waitress try her best. She took a deep breath, whispering to herself, "You can do this." Even though part of her wanted to run, lock herself in the bathroom, and hide until the night ended. As the first guests started to arrive, voices floating in through the lobby, laughter and perfume and expensive shoes tapping the floor. She adjusted her posture, placed her fingers on the keys again, and prepared. She could hear the servers taking orders, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversations rising like waves. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, but she kept them steady, waiting for the moment when she would have to start. She thought of her grandmother, of the old keyboard, of practicing in the dark, of all the nights she believed and all the days she doubted. This was her moment, even if it lasted only one song, even if no one liked it, even if she messed up and had to walk away, it was her moment. And as the lights dimmed slightly to signal the start of the evening, Elena took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a heartbeat, and prepared to play the first note that might change everything. When the first guests fully settled into the dining room, it felt like the air itself grew heavier. Like every breath carried expectations Elena wasn't sure she could meet. She sat at the piano with her hands resting on her lap for a moment, grounding herself, feeling the slight tremble beneath her skin like her nerves were trying to escape. From her seat, she could see everything. Polished tableware reflecting chandelier light, servers gliding across the floor with trays held high, guests adjusting their suits and gowns, ready to be impressed. A few of the guests looked at her with confusion, whispering to each other, noticing her apron tied around her waist, not understanding why the person meant to serve them was sitting at the piano instead. Someone at a table near the front leaned toward their friend and spoke loud enough for her to hear. "Is this some kind of theme night?" they asked in a tone that wasn't mean but definitely not supportive. Another person chuckled under their breath and said, "They must be desperate." And Elena felt her throat tighten, her fingers curling slightly like she was trying to protect the music under her skin. She tried to ignore the comments, reminding herself that people didn't know her yet, that their doubt came from not knowing her story, not from truth. The manager stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes sharp, not unkind but firm, like she was holding her breath too, waiting for proof that this was worth the risk. Elena inhaled slowly, lifted her hands, and placed them on the keys again, feeling the cool surface like reassurance. A reminder that she had always belonged to music even if the world didn't see it yet. She wasn't sure what song to start with. Everything she knew suddenly felt like it didn't matter, like her mind was blank and her fingers were strangers to her own talent. But then she remembered something her grandmother had said, a phrase that floated into her memory like a guiding light. "Start with honesty, child. Music listens before it speaks." So she chose a song she had written on one of her hardest nights, when the laundromat below her apartment was so loud she couldn't sleep, when grief and hope tangled together in her chest like threads she couldn't separate. a song she had never named but always understood. The first note was soft, almost too quiet, like a secret testing its strength. But it rang clear enough to ripple across the tables, cutting through conversations like a quiet knock on a closed door. Then she played the next note, and the next, letting the melody unfold gradually, gentle but sure, like morning sunlight climbing over rooftops, not rushing but steady in its arrival. At first, many guests continued talking, forks clinking, voices layered like static over her music. But she didn't let it throw her off. She stayed focused, letting the rhythm guide her breathing, letting the chords settle her heart. Slowly, the room shifted, conversations softened, eyes lifted, and heads turned. Not all at once, but like a wave spreading across the shore, subtle and unstoppable. A couple at the back of the room stopped mid-sentence, their attention drifting to the piano, surprise on their faces as if they hadn't expected to hear something so delicate in a place so formal. A man in a suit lowered his wine glass, watching her hands, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. Even the servers slowed down slightly, their steps becoming careful, their eyes flicking toward her between tasks, like they were seeing her for the first time instead of just passing by her every day. The music grew, her fingers gaining confidence, the melody expanding like wings opening, the notes filling the room with warmth she didn't know she could share so freely. She didn't try to show off. She didn't reach for the hardest pieces she knew. She just played from a place that felt true, honest, like offering her heart without apology. Minutes passed. She wasn't sure how many, time blurring like watercolors on wet paper, blending into the music. But then, like a cloud drifting away, she felt eyes on her. A different kind of gaze. Not just curiosity but something sharper, disapproving, like a cold wind in a warm room. It came from a woman seated near the center, dressed elegantly, posture perfect. Her chin raised as if she were inspecting something beneath her. The woman whispered something to the person next to her, her lips curving down, her expression like she was tasting something bitter. Then she raised her hand and signaled a server, her voice carrying just enough for Elena to hear. "Why is the help performing?" she asked, her tone polite but cutting like a blade wrapped in silk. "I was expecting professionalism, not experiments." The words hit Elena harder than she expected, slicing into her confidence, pulling her attention away from the keys for just a moment. Her fingers faltering barely, a hesitation in the song that felt like a bruise, her heart hammered in her chest, throat tightening, vision blurring at the edges. She nearly stopped, nearly stood up and walked away, apologizing for even trying. But she didn't. Somehow, she didn't, because another sound reached her right then. A small but firm voice from a table nearby saying, "I think she's wonderful." Not loud, not dramatic, just sincere. Elena didn't look to see who said it. She just let the words sink into her like a bomb, like someone placing a hand gently on her shoulder and saying, "Keep going." So she did. She kept going, the song regaining its rhythm, her fingers smoothing out the stumble and turning it into part of the music, as if it had always been meant to be there. The critical woman watched her still, but her expression softened slightly, not approval, not admiration, but curiosity, and that was enough. Elena didn't need anything more than that. She played the final stretch of the piece with renewed strength, letting the melody bloom into something bolder, like the moment right before sunrise when the sky decides it's time for light. When the last note echoed and faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like the air had weight and warmth and meaning. No one clapped, not yet, not because they didn't want to, but because it felt like no one wanted to break the moment, like applause might shatter something fragile and sacred that still lingered in the room. It was the manager who moved first, stepping closer to the piano, her voice calm but carrying across the room. "You may continue," she said, the words simple but layered with something new, something like trust. Elena nodded, swallowing hard, her breath shaky but freed from the tightness that had been choking her moments ago. She didn't have time to think. The night was moving, guests still arriving, servers needing space to move, conversations returning but quieter now, tinted with the residue of her music. She turned the page in her notebook that she kept tucked beside her. unsure of which piece to play next but knowing she couldn't hesitate forever. Behind her, she heard the server who had smirked earlier whisper to someone, "Who knew?" His voice not mocking now, but impressed in spite of himself. Someone else laughed quietly, not unkindly, saying, "She's full of surprises." Elena wasn't sure how to feel, but the words didn't hurt like they would have before. They didn't feel like doubt. They felt like acknowledgement, and that was something she had never had in this place. She chose another song, one a little faster, filled with hope that rose and fell like stairs climbing toward something better, something higher, something waiting. Her hands found the keys again, more sure this time, like her fingers remembered before her mind did. Like her body trusted the music even when her fear didn't. The crowd settled into a rhythm, listening not with full attention but with something gentler, casual admiration. The kind that didn't demand perfection but appreciated honesty. As she played, servers passed by, sometimes pausing briefly like the music tugged at them, reminding them of their own forgotten dreams, their own quiet talents tucked away behind rent and responsibilities. For a moment, it felt like the whole room was connected by invisible threads, drawn gently toward the piano, not pulled, just invited. Elena felt it too, a sense that maybe she wasn't out of place after all, that maybe the piano didn't care about status or resumes, that maybe music didn't belong to the wealthy or the trained, but to whoever needed it the most. Even the woman who had questioned her now leaned back in her chair, her expression softer, contemplative, her fingers tapping lightly against her wine glass in rhythm with the music like she was unaware her body was responding. Elena played until her shoulders relaxed, until the tension in her jaw eased, until her heartbeat matched the tempo instead of racing ahead of it. There was a moment when she almost smiled. Almost. Because she realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving the moment, she was living in it, fully present, fully herself. Still, doubt lingered at the edges of her mind like fog. Not gone but lighter, waiting for an excuse to roll back in. But she didn't give it the chance, not tonight. She didn't know if this night would change anything about her life, if it would lead anywhere, if it would matter beyond these walls. But she knew it mattered right now, in this moment, and that was enough. She finished her second song, and this time, there was applause, not thunderous, not overwhelming, but real, sincere, human. And she felt her breath catch as people looked at her with something new in their eyes. Not confusion, not dismissal, but respect. Her fingers hovered above the keys again, waiting, ready, maybe for the first time ever. She felt like she could keep going, like she had earned her place. Not because she was perfect, but because she tried. In that applause, she heard her grandmother's voice, her mother's tired smile, her younger self practicing in the laundromat noise, all of it echoing in the clapping hands of strangers. And just as the applause died down, just as Elena prepared to start her next piece, something happened near the entrance, the sound of the doors opening, the shift of attention, heads turning as a new guest stepped inside. Someone whose presence alone seemed to matter more than the rest. Elena didn't know who they were yet. She just felt the shift, like the next chapter of her life was waiting, just outside her line of sight. She took a shaky breath and placed her hands on the keys, ready for whatever came next, even if she didn't know where it would lead. The doors opened with a soft rush of air, and a hush moved through the room like someone had flipped a switch. Elena didn't look up at first. She kept her eyes on the keys, but she could feel the attention of the room shift like sunlight moving across a floor. Footsteps echoed, slow and confident, not rushed like someone trying to be important, but calm like someone used to being noticed. She forced herself to keep playing, her fingers moving through a familiar sequence of notes, even though her heart wanted to stall and see who had just arrived. The manager straightened immediately, smoothing her jacket and stepping forward, her posture changing into something sharper, more formal, like she was welcoming a guest who mattered in a different way. A host rushed ahead, pulling out a chair at a reserved table near the front. The best seat in the house, the one usually given to guests the hotel couldn't afford to disappoint. Elena finally looked up, just briefly, between phrases of music, and saw a person she recognized from local news stories displayed on the television screens in the laundromat downstairs. He was an older man with silver hair and glasses, dressed in a suit that looked expensive but comfortable. Like he didn't need to prove anything with it. He was a well-known scholar from a nearby music academy. Someone who had written books about the importance of emotional expression in music. Someone who had trained some of the city's most respected pianists. Elena had never seen him in person, only in interviews and newspaper photos taped up in music shop windows. But even from a distance, he looked exactly how she imagined someone from that world would look. He sat down and didn't look at the menu, didn't look at the servers, didn't even greet the manager for more than a polite nod. Instead, his eyes focused on the piano, sharp but warm, studying without judging. Elena's breath caught, her chest tightening. Her fingers trembled for just a second. The slightest break in the smooth rhythm of the song. She was sure he heard it, that tiny stumble, the kind she could hide from most people but not from someone like him. Someone with ears trained to notice the smallest shift like a change in weather. She closed her eyes for a moment, not long enough to break the flow, just long enough to remind herself that this was her music, her moment, and she didn't owe perfection to anyone. Not even him. When she opened her eyes again, she let her hands move like she was telling her story, not performing for approval, adding a little more pressure to the keys, softening certain phrases the way she felt them. Not the way she thought they were expected to sound. She played the ending with a kind of bravery she hadn't known before tonight, letting the final notes fade without rushing them. Like the silence after was part of the song too. She lifted her hands slowly, letting the sound settle, and the room stayed quiet longer than usual, like people didn't know if they were allowed to speak yet. Then the applause started, gentle but sincere, growing just enough to make her cheeks burn with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She didn't bow. She just nodded, her hands trembling slightly on her lap, unsure of how to hold gratitude that felt too big for her. The scholar watched her still, his hands resting on the table, fingers steepled. His expression unreadable in a way that made her nervous and hopeful all at once. The manager approached him and said something Elena couldn't hear. But he didn't look away from the piano, and Elena could feel the weight of that attention like a spotlight she hadn't asked for. She wanted to disappear for a moment, to hide behind a curtain and breathe. But the night wasn't over, and she knew she had to keep going. A server passed by and whispered, "You're doing great." So quietly she almost wondered if she imagined it. Another placed a glass of water on the piano for her, a small kindness in the middle of a storm she didn't know how to navigate. Elena wiped her palms on her apron and chose her next song, one with a clearer structure, something she could anchor herself to while the room pressed closer with its attention. She started to play again, and this time, something unexpected happened, something delicate but powerful. The music came easier, like the keys were guiding her instead of the other way around. Like the piano finally recognized her not as a stranger but as someone who knew how to listen. Her confidence didn't come in a burst. It arrived like a slow bloom, petal by petal, building in the spaces between each note, filling her lungs with steadier breaths. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was sharing, offering something human, something flawed but honest, and it showed. People leaned in more, conversations faded further. Even the clinking of dishes seemed quieter, like the room itself was learning how to listen. The scholar leaned back slightly, eyes half closed, not in sleep or boredom, but like he was absorbing the music the way someone listens to a story they've been waiting to hear. When she finished the second piece, the applause came quicker, fuller, not loud enough to disturb the formality of the place, but real enough to reach the back of the room and make its way back to her like a tide. Elena felt her heartbeat steadier now, not calm exactly, but aligned with something purposeful, like she finally understood the map she'd been following even before she ever saw it. But the night wasn't done testing her, not yet. A server hurried over to the manager, panic visible in the way her steps snapped against the floor, whispering something urgently. The manager's face tightened, and she glanced at Elena with a look that made her stomach drop. A guest had requested a song, a classical piece known for its difficulty. A piece Elena knew only from listening but had never been taught properly, never practiced in full. It wasn't a cruel request. The guest didn't even know who she was. It was casual in the way someone might ask for a dish not realizing the kitchen didn't have the ingredients. The manager walked over, speaking in a low voice, They want Moonlit Stairway. Can you play it? Her tone wasn't demanding, but it carried the urgency of the night. Elena's breath faltered, her chest tight. She knew the piece, but not well enough to play it comfortably in front of people, let alone in front of someone like the scholar. She could say no. She could decline politely. No one would blame her, not really. They had already gotten more from her than expected. But she remembered the keyboard at home, the laundromat noise, her grandmother's hands guiding hers, her mother saying, "Keep playing." Her younger self dreaming of moments exactly like this. She didn't know the full song, but she knew pieces of it, and she knew herself. She knew she could fill the gaps with emotion if not with technique. She could adapt, like she always had, so she nodded, even though fear clung to her ribs like vines. "I can try," she said. Not a promise, not a boast, just a truth. The manager hesitated, searching her face, then stepped back with a small nod. Trust given like a fragile gift. Elena took a deep breath, placing her fingers carefully, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like snowfall. She began, her hands moving slower than usual at first, remembering the melody like recalling a dream, recognizing landmarks in a landscape she had only visited in her mind. She didn't play it perfectly. She made choices, small changes, smoothing transitions she didn't know, adding pauses where her memory faltered, letting intuition fill the spaces where knowledge failed. Her version wasn't the version taught in music academies or played on competition stages. It was patched with her own voice, her own life, her own hands. It was Moonlit Stairway, but it was also Elena, woven into the music like a thread of gold running through dark cloth, visible if you knew where to look. The room didn't know the difference, or maybe they did, but they didn't care because what she offered wasn't accuracy, it was feeling, and feeling has its own vocabulary. When she reached the part she didn't know at all, the part she had never heard clearly enough to memorize, she improvised, trusting herself like someone learning to walk across stepping stones in the dark. She adjusted chords, changed the tempo, made the moment her own, not to hide mistakes but to honor the music in the only way she could. And to her surprise, it worked, not flawlessly, not elegantly, but honestly, and that honesty held the room, kept it listening. When she finished, there was no silence like before. The applause came instantly, rising like a wave, not wild, not explosive, but full of respect, a recognition that she had done something brave. Elena blinked fast, trying to steady her breathing, overwhelmed not by perfection but by having survived it, having lived through the fear and created something anyway. She looked up and saw the scholar watching her, not with polite curiosity now, but with something different, something brighter, something that looked like recognition. He didn't clap right away, he just nodded once, slowly, like someone writing a note in their mind they intended to revisit later. Then he clapped, just twice, but the sound felt louder than all the other applause, reaching her in a way she didn't know applause could. Elena lowered her gaze, her hands shaking in her lap, not from weakness now, but from the weight of a moment that might be bigger than it looked. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if tonight would change her life or only change the way she saw herself. All she knew was that something inside her had shifted permanently, like a door had opened, and even if she never walked through it, she could never pretend it wasn't there. She played the rest of the night with a steadiness she hadn't known she was capable of, her music no longer asking permission to exist. And when the final guests left and the lights began to dim, Elena's world felt both the same and entirely different, like she was standing in her old shoes but the ground beneath her had changed shape. When the last note of the night faded, it felt like a page turning inside the hotel, not loud or dramatic, but like a soft click of fate moving into place. Elena sat there for a moment longer than she needed to, fingers still hovering above the keys, afraid that if she moved too quickly the whole night would reveal itself as a dream. The restaurant lights were dimming, guests slipping out the doors, their voices floating away like echoes of conversations that had once seemed too big for her world. Servers began clearing tables, stacking plates, wiping spills, returning the room to its usual calm, back to a place where the piano was just furniture again. Not a spotlight, not a risk, not a miracle. The manager approached her slowly, like someone cautious about breaking a spell, her footsteps quiet, her eyes softer than Elena had ever seen them. "Elena," she said, voice balanced between pride and disbelief. "You did well tonight." Those 4 words landed heavier than applause, because they were real. They were from someone who had doubted her, who had seen her stumble and keep going, and still chose to say it. Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice yet, afraid that if she spoke, she would cry. Not from sadness, but from the weight of everything she had carried alone until now. The manager continued, "You can continue training here, and if you want, we can discuss letting you play regularly on slower nights." Her tone careful, like offering a gift she wasn't sure Elena would accept. Elena felt her chest tighten, a mix of hope and fear curling like vines around her ribs. But before she could respond, the scholar stood up from his seat, straightening his jacket like the night was only now beginning for him. He walked toward the piano with the slow confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime being listened to, someone who no longer needed to raise his voice to be heard. Elena's hands gripped the edge of the bench, her heart pounding again, not like before the first note, but like before a door she never expected to see. Now standing open, waiting. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with the measured silence of a person who didn't waste words, who let thoughts settle before speaking. And finally he said, "Where did you learn to play like that?" His voice wasn't sharp or testing, it was curious, like someone trying to solve a riddle, like the answer mattered more than he expected. Elena swallowed, her voice shaky but honest. "At home, on an old keyboard, my grandmother taught me." He nodded, absorbing the information like a puzzle piece sliding into place. "You play with instinct, not imitation," he said. "That is rare." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, afraid that any words she tried to add would sound unworthy of the moment. "You made mistakes," he continued, and the words hit like cold water, but not cruel, not meant to shame. But they were human mistakes, improvised with purpose, not fear. That sentence alone felt like a spotlight on the part of her she always hid, the part that believed mistakes were proof she didn't belong. He looked at the piano, running his fingers lightly over the closed lid. "Technique can be taught," he said. "Fearlessness cannot." She realized then that he hadn't come to compliment her. He had come to see if she understood her own worth, to see if she recognized what she carried. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, placing it gently on the corner of the piano. "Contact me," he said. "If you are willing to work, I am willing to teach." The card sat there like a key, small and harmless, but heavy with promise, heavy with the kind of future she had only seen from the outside. Elena stared at it, not touching it yet, afraid that if she picked it up too fast, the universe would take it back. The manager's eyes widened slightly, like she understood the weight of the moment as well. Like she knew that if Elena accepted, the restaurant might only be a stepping stone, not a destination. "You don't have to decide now," the scholar said, his voice softer. "Dreams are not doors you must run through, sometimes you walk." And with that, he nodded and stepped away, joining the flow of guests leaving the room, not looking back, trusting that if she was meant to follow this path, she would. Elena reached out slowly, her fingertips brushing the card like someone touching a memory, and finally picked it up, folding it gently and slipping it into her apron pocket like a secret she needed to protect. Her shift wasn't over. She still needed to help clean, stack chairs, wipe tables, close the register, return to the part of her life that didn't know what had just happened. But nothing felt the same. The chairs didn't look like chairs. The tables didn't look like tables. Everything looked like places she had survived, not places she was trapped in. As she stood, her legs shook with exhaustion, adrenaline wearing off, leaving her body heavy but her spirit strangely light. Like a balloon tied down by strings she was learning to untie. In the staff room, other servers hovered nearby, pretending not to stare but sneaking glances like they were trying to understand her all over again. One server finally spoke, a girl with tired eyes and a gentle voice. "I always knew you were quiet, but I didn't know you were brave," she said, like bravery was something she could recognize on sight. Elena didn't know if she was brave. She just knew she didn't want to regret silence more than she feared failure. Another server approached, holding a stack of menus. "You made tonight feel different," he said, In a good way. They didn't ask for pictures or signatures or stories. They didn't treat her like someone new, just someone more seen. And that felt like respect, not attention she didn't know how to handle. When the last chair was stacked and the last light turned off, Elena stepped outside into the cold night air, her breath fogging in front of her like smoke signals rising toward a sky that suddenly felt less distant. The street was quiet, the city humming softly around her, the world unchanged. But her place in it noticeably altered, like she had been given permission to belong. Even if she didn't know where yet, she walked home, the card in her pocket a constant weight against her thigh, grounding her, reminding her, whispering that possibilities were not fantasies. They were invitations. Above the laundromat, the hallway smelled like detergent and memories, the kind of scent that might have once felt like limitation but now felt like origin, like proof of how far she had come just to reach tonight. Her mother was asleep on the couch, still in her work clothes, exhaustion written across her body like a story she never asked to tell. Elena knelt beside her, pulling a blanket up gently, careful not to wake her. Feeling a swell of gratitude so strong it made her eyes sting, she walked to the old keyboard, the one with missing keys and buzzing speakers, and plugged it in, the familiar crackle greeting her like an old friend. She sat down, not to practice, not to fix mistakes, but to remember, to honor everything that had led to the moment where someone from the world she dreamed of looked at her and said, "You are worth teaching." She pressed a single key, one that buzzed slightly, but tonight the sound didn't feel broken. It felt like beginning, like the first step onto a stairway she once thought she would only ever watch from the bottom. She closed her eyes, thinking of the scholar's words, of the applause, of the doubt that didn't win, of the courage she didn't know she had. And then she whispered to herself, barely audible, but real, "I can do this." The words shaking but present, like a spark trying to ignite. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she was ready. She didn't know if she would succeed. But for the first time, she didn't fear the unknown as much as she feared not trying. The night ended with her hands resting on the keys, her heart beating steady, the laundromat rumbling below like applause she imagined the universe was giving her. And as she finally stood to go to bed, she whispered a thank you, not to anyone specific, but to every moment, every struggle, every lesson that had carried her here, to the edge of a future she could finally reach for, because tonight, she hadn't just played music. She had played her life, and people listened. Morning light filtered into the small apartment like a soft reminder that the world continued even after life-changing nights. Elena woke before her alarm, her eyes opening to a ceiling she had seen 1,000 times. Yet today it felt new, lighter somehow, like the shadows had shifted just enough to show her something she hadn't noticed before. She lay still for a moment, gripping the edge of her blanket, replaying the night in her mind like a movie she was afraid to touch in case it faded. Was it real? She wondered. The applause, the scholar, the business card, the courage, the risk, the survival of fear, the stumble that didn't end her. Her chest rose and fell with the question. And then she reached into the pocket of her jacket hanging nearby, fingertips brushing against the folded card like a pulse. It was still there, solid proof she hadn't imagined it. A small rectangle of possibility wrapped in paper and ink. She sat up slowly, feet touching the cold floor. Her body sore in places she didn't expect, nerves and adrenaline leaving behind the aches of effort she had poured into the piano. The sound of the laundromat downstairs had already begun, machines rumbling like distant thunder, the rhythm of her childhood mornings. Her mother wasn't in the apartment anymore. She had left early for her shift, a note on the counter reading, "Breakfast in the fridge, I'm proud of you." In handwriting that leaned toward exhaustion but still carried warmth, those words hit her harder than the applause had, because they came from someone who had seen her struggle up close, every day. Not just the polished pieces of herself she showed to strangers. Elena made tea, letting the steam rise like a quiet comfort, warming her hands as she held the mug, grounding herself in the ordinary before facing the extraordinary. She stared at the business card on the table, afraid to pick it up again like it might ask her to choose. Right now, today, and she didn't know if she was ready. Part of her wanted to call immediately, to rush forward before doubt caught up. But another part wanted to wait, to breathe, to think, to plan. to be sure she wasn't acting out of panic or desperation. She reminded herself of what the scholar had said. Dreams are not doors you must run through, sometimes you walk. And she tried to believe it. School felt heavier that day, like the hallways were too narrow to hold both the person she had been yesterday and the person she was trying to become today. She sat at her desk in class, trying to take notes, but her mind drifted back to the piano, to the keys beneath her fingers, to the way the music had felt like speaking her own language for the first time in public. Her teacher called her name more than once, asking if she was okay, if she needed a break, if she wanted to talk, and Elena just nodded, giving polite reassurances, not ready to explain the change she didn't fully understand yet. During lunch, she sat outside alone, the cold biting at her cheeks, her breath puffing out in faint clouds, the card in her pocket like a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. She took it out again, reading the name, the title, the contact information, letting the letters settle into her memory like a promise. She didn't know what to say if she called, how to introduce herself, if she was supposed to be formal or casual, if she needed to prepare something, or if the scholar just meant it in a polite way, like a compliment disguised as an opportunity. Her fear whispered, what if he didn't mean it? What if he changes his mind? What if last night was a fluke? But another voice, quiet but steady, pushed back. What if he did mean it? What if last night was the beginning? What if you try? She closed her eyes for a second, letting the cold settle her racing nerves, and she made a decision, not a final one, but a first step. She would call after her shift tonight, when she could breathe, when she could sit with the piano and remember why she wanted this in the first place. At the hotel, everything looked the same, but people looked at her differently. Not with awe, not with fame, but with a recognition that felt like sunlight on her skin. The same servers who used to walk past her without noticing now offered small smiles. Nods, doorways of respect opening wordlessly. One server handed her a towel and said, heard you got an offer. Not jealous, not judgmental, just acknowledging. Like saying the truth out loud made it lighter. Elena just shrugged, trying to keep her heartbeat calm. Maybe, she said, her voice quiet, her expression unsure. Not because she doubted the offer, but because she didn't want to say it like a certainty before she reached for it. The manager pulled her aside before the dinner service began, leading her to the quieter corner near the service station where fresh linens were stacked like towers of responsibility. I want to say this clearly, the manager said, not looking at her like an employee but like a person. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, you have a place here. Elena nodded, her throat tight, the words landing with a weight she didn't know how to hold. I won't stand in your way, the manager added, and that sentence alone felt like a door unlocking. But I also won't let you shrink yourself to stay comfortable. Elena blinked, shocked to hear something so kind wrapped in something so stern, and the manager continued, if you want to stay, stay because you choose to, not because you're scared to leave. Those words took root in Elena's mind like seeds waiting for rain, and she nodded, her voice barely present. Thank you. The shift went by slower than usual, her body moving through familiar motions while her mind spun like pages flipping in a windstorm. Serve, clear, refill, smile, repeat. But underneath it all, her music pulsed, waiting. At the end of the night, when her apron was untied and the lights were off, she walked to the piano again, not to play for anyone else, but to sit with herself. She placed the business card on the music stand, as if the piano needed to see it too, as if the keys might remind her who she was becoming. Then she dialed the number, her thumb trembling, her breath caught between fear and hope, the ringtone stretching into eternity. A voice answered, calm and clear. This is the Academy office. Elena almost hung up, panic clawing at her throat, but she forced herself to speak. Hello, this is Elena. I played at the hotel last night. The professor gave me his card. There was a pause, then the receptionist's tone softened. Yes, he mentioned you might call. And those words alone made Elena close her eyes, relief hitting like warmth. He would like to meet with you for an evaluation. Evaluation, Elena repeated, the word heavy, unfamiliar. A test she hadn't studied for. Yes, the receptionist said. Just to hear you play, to discuss training, to see what you need. Elena swallowed, the room around her blurring slightly. When? She asked, voice barely audible. Tomorrow morning, came the answer. If that's too soon, we can reschedule. Tomorrow, the word echoed like a bell, like the edge of a leap. She almost said no, almost asked for a later date. More time, more space, more preparation. But then she remembered last night, the music, the mistakes that didn't ruin her, the fear that didn't win. Tomorrow is fine, she heard herself say, like the courage came from somewhere outside of her, somewhere wiser. They exchanged details, instructions, directions, polite goodbyes, and before Elena knew it, the call was over, and she was left alone with the silence of a decision that no longer lived in the future but in the present. She sat at the piano for a long time, breathing in and out, letting the truth settle. Tomorrow she would step into a world she had only ever watched from far away. The walk home felt shorter than usual, her legs moving on autopilot, her mind rehearsing the morning like a script she hoped to remember. At home, she told her mother, not with grandeur or confidence, but with quiet honesty, I have an evaluation tomorrow. Her mother stared for a moment, surprise and fear and pride flickering like shifting colors behind her eyes, and then she nodded. Then you'll go, she said, voice firm, because you're ready to find out. There were no speeches, no dramatic tears, just a hand on Elena's shoulder, steady and warm, like a blessing. Elena didn't sleep much, her mind too full, her dreams too loud, but she rested anyway. Eyes closed, body still, heart learning its new rhythm. Morning came like a challenge and a promise all at once. The air crisp, the sky a dull blue warming into brightness. She wore her cleanest clothes, brushed her hair twice, packed her sheet music even though she wasn't sure she'd need it, kissed her mother's cheek, and stepped outside. The streets looked the same, but she walked them like someone who wasn't just passing through but moving toward something. Each step a sentence in a story she hadn't finished writing. At the academy, the doors were tall and quiet, the kind of quiet that demanded respect, not silence, a quiet filled with possibility rather than emptiness. She signed in, hands shaking, feet tapping, trying to anchor herself to the moment. The receptionist led her to a small room with a piano that made her breath hitch, polished and perfect, keys like a promise, a test, a chance. She sat, waited, hands folded, back straight, trying not to let the fear swallow her whole. Then the professor entered, setting his bag down gently, greeting her with a nod instead of a handshake, as if formality wasn't needed, just truth. He sat across from her, hands folded, eyes calm, and said, "Play what you played last night." Elena knew what song he meant, the improvised one, the one patched together with instinct and emotion instead of training. Her hands hovered, everything inside her trembling. But she found the keys, the melody, the courage, and she played, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but honestly, like she had nothing to hide and everything to give. When she finished, the professor exhaled slowly, leaned back, and said 8 words that changed the shape of her fear forever. "You are not ready, but you are possible." The sentence hit her like sunlight breaking through a storm. Not praise, not criticism, but direction. "You need training," he continued. "Foundation, discipline, guidance." His tone steady. "If you are willing to work, I will help you." Elena's heart stuttered, not with doubt, but with recognition. This was not the end, or a miracle, or a victory. This was the beginning she had earned. She nodded, tears burning her eyes. "I'm willing," she said, her voice breaking but present. The professor nodded back, as if sealing an agreement, a contract unwritten but understood. "Then we begin," he said, simple as that, like starting meant breathing, like starting was enough. Elena felt it then, not certainty, not confidence, but direction, a compass where fear used to be. She didn't know how long it would take. She didn't know how hard it would be, but she finally knew what path her feet belonged to. And as she left the academy, stepping into the cold with the wind brushing against her face like applause, she whispered to herself, "I'm not done," because she wasn't. She was just starting. Elena left the academy feeling like the world had doubled in size. Not because the streets were different or the sky had changed, but because she finally saw a future she could walk toward instead of just dream about. She held the folder the professor had given her, filled with handwritten notes and practice schedules, the kind that looked impossible at first glance, like a mountain disguised as paper. She stood outside for a long moment, her breath visible in the cold air, the morning sun turning frost into tiny sparks on the pavement, like the world was applauding quietly just for her. She walked home slower than usual, the wind pushing against her coat like a reminder that growth often comes with resistance, that progress sometimes feels like a storm you need to walk through instead of around. At home, the apartment smelled like laundry soap and coffee. Her mother sitting at the small kitchen table flipping through a newspaper, her eyes lifting with worry and pride when she saw the folder in Elena's hands. "Well?" her mother asked, voice steady but hopeful, like she was bracing herself for a truth she wasn't sure she could handle. Elena sat across from her, fingertips tracing the edge of the folder, her voice soft but steady. "He said I'm not ready?" She paused, watching her mother's face fall slightly, then added, "But he said I'm possible." Her mother exhaled, relief and emotion mixing like warm air meeting winter, and she nodded. "Then that's enough," she said. "For now it's enough." It felt like a blessing, simple and small but powerful, like someone placing a steady hand between her shoulder blades and saying, "Keep going." The next weeks began like a new chapter, one she wrote in exhaustion and excitement, waking before the sun to practice scales at the old keyboard before school, her fingers stumbling, learning, correcting, growing. She studied music theory during lunch breaks, leaning over borrowed books from the library, pages filled with symbols she had never learned but was eager to understand, like learning a new alphabet for a language her heart already spoke. Some days the music felt like a gift, flowing through her hands like something alive, her progress obvious, her hope loud. Other days it felt like wrestling with shadows, frustration thick in her throat, mistakes piling up like stones she tripped on again and again. She questioned herself on those days, wondered if she was foolish, if she had misunderstood the professor's offer, if her dream was too heavy for her to carry. But every time doubt tried to build a home in her mind, she remembered the sound of applause, the moment the scholar had said, "If you are willing to work, I will teach." And she refused to let fear be louder than that memory. The hotel became different too, not because the building changed, but because she changed the way she walked inside it, no longer shrinking at the door, no longer feeling like she was made of apology. Some nights the manager asked her to play 1 or 2 songs at the piano before her shift started. Nothing official, nothing paid, just practice, just trust, just space to exist as more than a waitress. Guests listened, sometimes absent-mindedly, sometimes with genuine interest, and Elena learned to accept both reactions without letting either define her. She learned that art is not always thunder. Sometimes it is drizzle, a quiet weather that touches people gently, even when they don't realize it. At school, she kept her new world mostly to herself, not because she was ashamed or afraid, but because she wanted to protect it, to let it grow before showing it to anyone who might not understand. On weekends, she went to the academy for lessons, sitting in rooms where walls held more knowledge than she had ever touched, where she was the least experienced person and yet the hungriest to learn. She struggled, she failed. She cried once in a practice room when her hands shook from nerves and she couldn't remember a single scale. But she did not quit. The professor never raised his voice, never discouraged her. Instead he said things like, "Frustration means you are fighting for something," and "the goal is not to avoid mistakes, but to understand them." And those sentences felt like maps. Over time, her hands changed, her muscles learning new habits, her fingers stretching further, moving faster, her ears sharpening, her mind absorbing theory like a sponge that had been waiting for water. She still worked at the hotel, still paid her part of the bills, still made dinner with her mother on tired nights, still helped her brother with homework, still practiced at the old keyboard, but now everything had a direction. Her life wasn't easier, but it was clearer, and clarity can feel like luck if you've lived without it long enough. Months passed, each day another stitch in the tapestry she was building. Not perfect, not even in straight lines, but held together by will and curiosity. One afternoon, the professor asked her to stay after class. His voice calm as always, but carrying a weight that made her pulse speed up. "You are improving," he said. "And more importantly, you are learning how to learn." Elena nodded, unsure where the conversation was going, afraid to hope too loudly in her chest. "There is an opportunity," he continued. "An audition for a youth program at the academy. Not a competition, a training initiative for students with potential." Potential. The word felt like both a compliment and a responsibility. Like being handed a torch she needed to keep lit in the wind. "It will not be easy," he warned. "You will be evaluated by multiple instructors, not just me. They will ask for precision, confidence, interpretation, and resilience." Elena swallowed hard, her palms sweating, her nerves curling into knots. But beneath the fear was something else. A spark. A familiar ache that sounded like music waiting to be played. "When is it?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 weeks, he answered. "If you want to try." 3 weeks, 21 days, a blink and a marathon all at once. Elena nodded. "I want to," she said, and it felt like signing a promise with her heartbeat. Those 3 weeks were the hardest she had ever lived. Mornings before sunrise practicing scales until her hands felt like they didn't belong to her. Afternoons at school holding back yawns in class. Evenings at the hotel clearing tables with sheet music echoing in her mind like a ghost. Nights practicing until the laundromat below closed and silence settled like dust. She learned how to play through fear, through fatigue, through the small voice that sometimes whispered, "What if you fail?" and answered it with, "Then I tried." The night before the audition, she sat at the piano in the hotel after closing, the lights reflecting in the glossy finish like constellations. Her hands hovering above the keys like birds unsure if they were ready to fly. The manager entered quietly, leaning against a nearby wall, watching her without interrupting, giving space without leaving, and after a moment said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that someone believed in you before anyone asked you to prove yourself." Elena nodded, blinking back tears, not because she was sad, but because sometimes support is heavy in a beautiful way, like a coat placed on your shoulders that warms you and reminds you of winter all at once. The audition morning came, crisp and bright, the city feeling like it was holding its breath with her. She stood outside the academy doors again, but this time, she did not feel like an outsider. She felt like a visitor with purpose, a traveler at the correct destination, even if she didn't know the language fluently yet. The evaluation room was large, echoing, a piano at the center like a throne. Instructors seated in a row like quiet judges, their eyes attentive but not cruel. Her hands trembled as she introduced herself, her voice shaking like leaves in wind. But she didn't run. She didn't apologize for her nerves. She let herself be nervous, because fear is honest and honesty is not a flaw. Then she played. She played the piece she had practiced for months, each note a step on a staircase she had built for herself, a staircase she once thought she would only ever watch other people climb. She made mistakes, not many, but noticeable, her left hand stumbling once, her right hand hesitating before a transition. But she didn't stop, she didn't panic, she breathed through it, she corrected, she continued, she remembered the professor's voice. Fearlessness cannot be taught. And she let the memory guide her hands like rails on a bridge. When she finished, there was silence, not cold, not tense, just silence that felt like thinking, like evaluation, like possibility being measured. The instructors whispered to each other. Then one of them leaned forward and said, "You do not have the training of our other applicants." And Elena's heart sank, but she didn't look away. She didn't hide. She waited. "But you have something they do not," the instructor continued. "You have direction, discipline, and a voice in your playing." Voice. That word alone felt like a chord resolving after a lifetime of tension. "We can build the rest," another instructor added. "If you are ready to work." Elena's breath caught, her throat tight, the room blurring slightly. "I am," she said, the words trembling but clear. "You're accepted," they replied. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just truthful, and truth was enough. Elena didn't jump, didn't shout. She just closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the moment land inside her like an anchor, like a home. like the beginning of a life she had been walking toward long before she knew the path existed. When she left the academy, she walked differently, not taller, not faster, but steadier, like her feet finally understood the ground they were standing on. At home, she placed her acceptance letter on the kitchen table, her mother's hands covering her mouth, eyes filling, not with fear this time, but with wonder. At the hotel, the piano waited, and she sat down, her fingers pressing the keys with gratitude, not to show off, not to prove anything, but to say thank you in the only language that ever fit her. She played, not the hardest piece she knew, not the cleanest, just the truest, a melody for laundromats and tired hands, for quiet dreams and loud fears, for mistakes that taught and fears that softened, for people who offered chances instead of criticism. She played for the girl she used to be and the woman she was becoming, a bridge made of music connecting two versions of herself. And when she finished, she stayed there for a moment, breathing, smiling softly, her reflection in the piano lid looking back at her like a friend. Her journey wasn't over, not even close, but for the first time she knew exactly where it continued. Forward, always forward, toward a future built note by note, mistake and miracle working together, not against each other, toward a stage she hadn't reached yet, but could finally imagine without fear, toward a world where her music wasn't a secret, but a story she was finally learning how to tell. One key, one breath, one try at a time.